It was a magnificent display of trained and disciplined valour, and its assault only failed of success because dead men can advance no further. This was the account of an officer of the Newfoundland Regiment after the attack at Beaumont-Hamel on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And this week we're going to explore the Newfoundland Memorial Park. Welcome to the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. Each week I give you a glimpse into the history of the Great War, and we travel together across the battlefields from Ypres to the Somme and beyond. So once more, let's get our pack and strap on our boots and head to the Somme. Newfoundland was the smallest colony in the British Empire to raise its own regiment in the Great War, the Newfoundland Regiment, later the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. It was granted that title in 1917. Today Newfoundland is part of Canada, but in the time of the First World War it wasn't, and its men did not join the Canadian Expeditionary Force. So in terms of the Great War, these men were not Canadians. This was not a Canadian regiment. The Newfoundland Regiment was actually a regiment of the British Army, and the only regiment of the British Army to be given a royal status, a royal title, while the war was still on. As we'll discover, such was the loss amongst these men here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, that there was a desire to purchase this ground to preserve it as the place where Newfoundland had made its greatest sacrifice in the Great War. Today, it's probably one of the most, if not the most, visited place on the Somme, if not indeed along the entire British sector of the Western Front. We'll begin our own visits, virtually here today, at the entrance to the park, and we'll see a stone wall and some very large boulders that were brought here from Newfoundland after the war as a reminder of home. A plaque on the wall records the fact that Sir Douglas Haig unveiled the park, inaugurated the park, in 1925. And as we come in through the entrance, if you came here yourself, at this point you would meet a young Canadian student. Newfoundland is now part of Canada, and the park is managed by the Canadian Veterans Affairs. And these young Canadians spend several months here every year, taking you round the park, acting as ambassadors for Canadian remembrance, and it's very much recommended that you go on one of their tours and they show you the story of what happened here. Over to our right is the modern visitor centre, which is always worth a visit. It tells the story of the Newfoundland Regiment in the Great War and the involvement of that nation in the conflict on a bigger scale, and also in detail the story of the events here in 1916. But we're going to act as if none of these are here, and we're going to begin our virtual walk. And as we come in through the entrance, the first thing that we will see is a trench going off to our right and a continuation of that trench going off to our left. This is St John's Road. This is the reserve line, the third line position. On the Western Front, in the British sector, there were three lines of trenches: a front line, a support line and a reserve line, the first, second and third lines. And this is that third line, that reserve line. And in this trench, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, in the approach to 0 hour, was the Newfoundland Regiment over to our left, and then in the continuation of the trench to our right was the 1st Battalion of the Essex Regiment. These were not in the first wave of the assault. They were the reserves, the men that would be called upon possibly if the attack didn't go as planned. They would be brought up to continue with the advance, and we'll return to that shortly. Continuing past this trench, we'll come to the 29th Division Memorial just ahead of us. It bears the red triangle battle flash of the 29th Division. Many of these units had a symbol that was worn on the uniforms of troops, and in the 29th Division they had a red triangle that later on in the war was sewn onto the upper tunic sleeve of men within this division. In 1916 it was sometimes painted on helmets. It was certainly painted on a lot of the wagons and limbers of units within the division. But here at Beaumont-Hamel on the first day of the Somme, it wasn't worn on the uniform. They cut the symbol out of biscuit tin, and it was attached to the packs of the men who went into battle. And this was something that had been done at Gallipoli in 1915, that the triangular-shaped tin reflected in the sun, and the observers who were watching attacks at Gallipoli went in could judge how far forward the men had got. And as that had worked well at Gallipoli, they decided to do the same thing here at Beaumont-Hamel. However, it was discovered that the glinting of these tin triangles would attract the attention of German snipers and machine gunners, particularly for wounded soldiers who were crawling through no man's land trying to find cover. So this was the last time that device was used in an attack by this division. Continuing past the memorial, we'll follow the path and we'll begin to come into an area where both to the left and right of us we will see indications of shell fire, shell craters. When I first used to come to this park, many of these were full of battlefield debris, barbed wire pickets, even a bit of a German machine gun. Most of that, if not all of it, has now rightly gone and it's preserved. As we come into an area where we can see trenches all around us, and we're coming into the second line, the support line area now, the Caribou Memorial will come into view. The bronze caribou we can see here is one of 5 caribous on the Western Front. One here at Beaumont-Hamel, another one at Gardecourt commemorating the regiment's second action on the Somme in October 1916, one at Monchy-le-Preux near Arras, where they fought in April 1917, another one on the Cambrai battlefields where they fought later that year, and the final one at Courtrai in Belgium, in Flanders, where the regiment fought its last action in October 1918. A 6th caribou is in Newfoundland itself, overlooking the spot where the regiment went to war in 1914. The caribou was chosen because it is a native animal of Newfoundland, a national symbol. It is the symbol used on the cap badge of the regiment, so it's an appropriate emblem to use on memorials like this. We'll now take a path round the back of the caribou and follow a gently rising path that'll take us to a viewing platform just beneath the caribou itself, and from here we'll have a fantastic view across the battlefields. So what happened here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme? To help you understand what I'm talking about during this explanation, I'm very grateful to Stephen Kerr for allowing me to use some of his fantastic air photos of the Newfoundland Park, which I'll put on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk. And those you can see the trenches and the layout of the park and what I'm talking about. So standing here in this elevated position, we've got the reserve line behind us, and we look down beneath us and we can see another trench going off across to our left. It's got some duckboards in it, modern duckboards, much more like Alan Titchmarsh style decking than the duckboards used in the First World War. And this marks the second line trench, the support line trench, that goes off to our left and runs in front of us just beneath us. We can see a communication trench coming out of this across to our left and another one across to our right, and these link up with the next line of trench, the front line trench, which is just across the grass field, the shell-pitted grass field, often with sheep in it grazing to cut the grass. So 3 lines of trenches, a front line, a support line and a reserve line. And we know that back in the reserve line is the Newfoundland Regiment and the 1st Battalion, the Essex Regiment. In the support line beneath us was the 1st Battalion, the Border Regiment, and in the front line was the 2nd Battalion, the South Wales Borderers. If we then look across no man's land, the wide stretch of grass, we can see a monument, a bronze figure of a Scotsman on a plinth. And that roughly marks the German front line in that area. So that's the German front line. And just behind that is a deep ravine, an old prehistoric quarry, snaking its way back to the village of Beaumont-Hamel, whose church spire and rooftops we can just see through the trees in the distance there. The Germans had occupied this position since the autumn of 1914, and it was men of the 119th Reserve Infantry Regiment that had built up the defences here. They were a Württemberg unit recruited in Stuttgart. Now, the Germans didn't really have POWs battalions, but this was essentially a Stuttgart POWs unit made up of men from that area that had all grown up in Stuttgart or the surrounding villages, and being reservists had been called back to the army on the outbreak of war and then sent off to the Western Front. They knew this ground intimately, and they had practiced time and time again that in case of an enemy attack, initially from the French who were here first and then the British, they could come up out of their positions and greet that attack in the space of about 15 minutes, timing that would be crucial come the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Aside from their trenches, the Germans also had deep dugouts here which they constructed into the sides of the wire ravine, with tunnels linking those dugouts to the front line. So it meant that the men could simply shelter in these dugouts from any enemy artillery fire, and at the moment of an enemy attack they could move up through those tunnels, get into the front line trench and be ready to fight off that attack. At 7:20 on the 1st of July, the Hawthorne mine was exploded just across to our left. We can't quite see the tops of the trees where the crater is today from here. That gave the German defenders around Beaumont-Hamel the last indication that a British attack was now imminent. And then at 7:30 a.m, the bombardment lifted from the front line positions around the wire ravine, and the Germans began to move up through those tunnels just as they'd practiced to get into the front line. On this side of no man's land, on the British side, the whistles were blown, and in the front line, 2nd South Wales Borderers moved up and out into no man's land. Now there's barbed wire in front of British trenches, just as there's barbed wire in front of German trenches, but the engineers had cut lanes through that wire to facilitate movement out into no man's land, and they'd even laid white tapes out there to show the men where to stand to await the orders of officers to move forward. Those orders were given, and the momentum of the attack led by the South Wales Borderers began. Coming up behind them was the 1st Border Regiment, who moved up from their trenches, and they moved up across the ground between the support line and the front line and began their assault. According to the British official history, the 2nd South Wales Borderers, who attacked particularly on the left quite close to the German front line around Wire Ravine, walked into particularly heavily concentrated German machine gun fire, and that attack, those attacking waves from that battalion, ceased to exist in the first 15 minutes of the battle. Coming up behind them was the 1st Battalion, the Border Regiment, and they too walked into the same withering machine gun fire. And again, according to the British official history, they ceased to exist sometime just after 8 o'clock on the 1st of July. So half an hour into the battle, and the 2 spearhead battalions here, South Wales Borderers and the Border Regiment, have gone. The local commander decides, rather than stop the attack, he'll continue with it, so he commits his reserves, the Newfoundland Regiment and the Essex Regiment, back in the reserve line. So runners arrive at their battalion headquarters with the orders that are required to give them the indication that they need to move up and make their attack. Now what this means, of course, is they've got to move from the reserve line to the support line, and then from the support line to the front line, and then jump off and make their assault. And by the time this happens, it's probably nearly an hour into the battle. It's sometime around about 8:30 in the morning. And this is a task that is easier said than done. They've got to move up through mainline trenches and communication trenches. There's no up trench and there's no down trench. It's up and down in the same trench. And coming in the opposite direction towards them are the walking wounded from the first waves and the stretcher cases being evacuated to the medical posts. These are the casualties from the initial attack, and it's very, very hard going. The men about to make their assaults are loaded up with all the gear that they need, and there's really just not enough space in these trenches for them to move up and for casualties to come back. On the Essex Regiment front, their commander decides to stick to the trenches. It's hard going, and he gets to the assault point late. On the Newfoundland Regiment front, the commander decides this is just ridiculous. This is too hard for his men to try and move up like this. So he decides to get them up above ground level and make the assault from there. So they come up out of these communication trenches and they assemble in open ground close to where the Caribou Memorial is today and begin their attack from there. What they don't realise is that the German machine gunners from the 119th Reserve Infantry Regiment can see them through their Zeiss field glasses. And although they might not hit them with direct fire, they can use their machine guns like artillery and lay down a machine gun barrage from a number of guns, creating what we'd now call a beaten zone, with a huge amount of machine gun fire falling into a given area, and anything that walked into it would become a casualty. And this is exactly what happens. So the Newfoundland Regiment loses men even before they get to their own front line. When they get to that front line, they have to move through the gaps in the wire just as the earlier waves had done. But the German machine gunners just simply retrain their weapons on these gaps, and very quickly they become blocked with the dead, the dying, and the wounded of the Newfoundland Regiment. The next wave of men who get through this, incredibly, move out into no man's land. Now this was agricultural fields before the war, and in the line of advance of the Newfoundland regiments is quite a steep bank that drops away, and on the edge of it the stump of a shattered tree, which became known as the danger tree to the men who were here. This ground, as the advance tried to move forward, was again swept by this same machine gun fire, and given the level of shell craters here, also German artillery fire by this stage was dropping onto the men of the Newfoundland Regiment. Very few officers were left at this stage, possibly only one subaltern, so it was almost a leaderless attack, and it quickly broke down as the men began to fall. A handful got to the German wire, and it said that some of them threw bombs at the German, threw grenades, and the Germans threw some back, and there is a rumour that one man may have even got into the German trenches here, but the attack had essentially failed. It's believed that 800 Newfoundlanders went into action in this attack. Some accounts said that 710 had become casualties, which is a staggering casualty rate. But modern research has shown that 266 were killed and 466 were wounded. That's a total casualty rate of 732 officers and men out of apparently 801 that went over the top. That's a nearly 90% casualty rate. So the battalion had ceased to exist in its first major battle of the Great War. And for Newfoundland, this would always be a special corner of the Western Front, a foreign field that for them was bathed in Newfoundland blood. And that's why there was such a desire to purchase this ground and preserve it after the war. We can't forget the role of the Essex Regiment. They were alongside the Newfoundlanders in the reserve line. They'd moved up and late for their attack had gone over the top. Their commander sent 2 companies forward and kept 2 companies back. And as those 2 companies moved forward, they too came under the same sort of withering machine gun fire that all the other battalions had experienced that day. One account describes how the machine gun fire coming from the parapet of the German trench hit many of the men in the legs as they moved forward. That was the level at which that gun was firing, and the bullets hit them just below the knee. And one of those who was wounded in that way on the first day of the Battle of the Somme was my great-uncle, Dan Boyles. He was a regular soldier who'd served before the war and had fought at the Battle of Le Cateau and in the retreat from Mons, the first Battle of Ypres, taken part in the Christmas truce, and he'd been wounded in early 1915, and on recovery from that wound had been posted to Gallipoli, where he joined the 1st Battalion of the Essex Regiment, having previously served in the 2nd. At Gallipoli he was shot through the elbow by a Turkish sniper, had some time off at Mudros and was there for the evacuation, and had been on the Western Front again since the spring of 1916. This was his 3rd wound of the war, and he was really the first Great War veteran that I ever met, my grandmother's brother, wounded here. Now the casualties in his company and the neighbouring company were so heavy that the commanding officer decided not to send any more men over. So the losses in the Essex Regiment only, and I say only in a very loose sense of the word, amounted to 229 officers and men, a fraction of the scale of the casualties suffered in the neighbouring Newfoundland Regiment. So what happened here after the 1st of July? Because on that day, with all these casualties, in fact in total the 29th Division suffered something like 5,500 casualties on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and they had very little to show for it. Some of the survivors out in no man's land, a mix of men from the South Wales Borderers, the Border Regiment, the Newfoundlanders and the Essex, connected up some of the shell holes that night to make a forward position, and eventually over the course of the following nights that trench was properly dug and a new line was formed out in no man's land and eventually connected by a communication trench. And you can see that on some of the air photos that Stephen Kerr has very kindly allowed us to use for this podcast. It's just forward of where the danger tree and that little embankment is located. It's a trench that often confuses people who go to the park, not quite sure what it is. So it's a trench dug after the 1st of July, the new front line. So for the loss of all these proud battalions on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, they'd managed to move the line here forward by tens of yards. Now, in between the 1st of July and the end of the Battle of the Somme, there were no further attacks in this area. It became a static part of the Somme front, and a lot of different units passed through here. The Guards Division were here for a while, including Raymond Asquith, the son of the Prime Minister, H.H. Asquith. He served in these trenches before he moved down to take part in the attack near Guillemont, where he was killed on the 15th of September 1916. Edmund Blunden, the war poet, arrived in this sector just as the Guards pulled out, and he served in these trenches for quite some time throughout 1916 before moving to the other side of the valley and taking part in the fighting around Thiepval. So for those 4 and a bit months from the first day of the Battle of the Somme until the 13th of November 1916, it was all quiet on the Western Front here, as much as any part of the Western Front was ever really quiet. At the end of the Battle of the Somme, another attack was made, because across to our right, on the other side of the valley towards Thiepval, the line there had gradually moved forward. They'd captured the Schwaben redoubts, and the positions there were now exposed because the Germans on this side of the valley could essentially fire into the rear of where the British front line was in that area. So this line needed to be moved forward. And in this sector, an attack was to be made by the men of the 51st Highland Division, and on their right, the men of the Royal Naval Division, who, like the 29th, had served at Gallipoli, and this was their first major battle on the Western Front. But the area where the park is the area where the Highland Division went in, and it's their attack that we'll talk about. The Jocks who fought here in November 1916 had a lot of things in their favour that the men of the 1st of July did not have. We tend to think that generals of the First World War fought the same battle again and again, just sent men over in lines of infantry to be mown down in no man's land, hoping to break through the German lines. That's a very simplistic way of looking at it. In the Battle of the Somme, the British Army evolved, and it's often said that the first day of the Battle of the Somme looked back to Waterloo, and the end of the Battle of the Somme looked forward to the fighting in Normandy. And what that essentially means is that the first day of the Battle of the Somme was a change in the way the army fought its approaches, and by the end of the battle it was fighting much more of a modern battle in a modern war. So tactics had changed and moved on. By this stage there was the creeping barrage that moved across the landscape, protecting the troops as they moved forward, suppressing the enemy so they could move in at the point of the bayonet and capture a position more easily. There was a much greater concentration of heavy artillery that could smash the German trenches and collapse in those deep dugouts. This is one of the predominant lessons of the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and the use of shrapnel to cut wire had been perfected by the end of the Battle of the Somme, so the uncut wire that was so characteristic of the first day of the battle was less of an issue in the final attack of November of 1916. So when these men went over the top on the 13th of November, they advanced following their barrage, went straight into the German lines, pushed through the wire ravine beyond, got into the village of Beaumont-Hamel, took the high ground beyond that, and from where we're standing, if we look into the far distance, we can see a number of small battlefield cemeteries in the fields around the other side of Beaumont-Hamel, and that marks essentially the high tide mark of the Battle of the Somme in this area of the battlefield. So leaving the viewing platform, we'll return to the area just beneath the Caribou, and here we'll see the Newfoundland Memorial. It is a memorial to the missing that commemorates men of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment who have no known grave, killed at Gallipoli and on the Western Front. And either side of it are men from Newfoundland who died in the Navy and Merchant Navy at sea. So it commemorates all of Newfoundland's missing for the First World War. So their names are not included on the great monuments like the Menin Gates, Tyne Cot or the Thiepval Memorial, for example. From here we'll go onto that modern style decking and we'll follow through the support line trench. And when you make this little walk, it is always worth doing because it gives you an idea of the size of trenches and how narrow they are. We'll follow it to the end, we'll go up the little steps, and we'll be out into some open ground then. And we're in that position where the 1st Border Regiment made their attack from the support line across towards the front line and indeed beyond. We'll follow the path that'll take us up to the front line area. We'll stop there, and if you look across to your left, you can see the front line trench moving off across that part of the park, and then to your right, similarly there. There's quite a lot of metal supports still in this part of the trench, and out in front of it are the barbed wire pickets, the corkscrew pickets that supported the barbed wire in front of the British trenches. And this is an area where you recall that the engineers had cut lanes through this wire so the men could get through it and out into no man's land unimpeded. But of course it also created kill zones for the German machine gunners to train their weapons on and wipe out the men as they attempted to move out. From here we'll continue down the path to the skeletal tree we can see sticking out of the bank. That's the bank that stood in the advance of the Newfoundland Regiment as they came through here on the 1st of July. This is the danger tree, and we can see how the ground around it was swept by shell fire, and on the 1st of July, of course, also machine gun fire from the German trenches. They're just ahead of us. We can see the wire ravine cemetery there, and the German line is just behind that. Machine gun fire coming from that direction, and if you look to your left, towards the Highland Division monument, machine gun fire coming from that way. So from two sides, enfilade fire firing into the flanks of the attack. Very deadly machine gun fire. We'll continue along the path, follow it down the hill. That'll bring us up in line with the new trench that was dug after the 1st of July, where the survivors in no man's land connected up the shell holes and a new front line was made. And there's a section of communication trench you can see that linked it back to the original front line. And then we'll continue round to the Wire Ravine Cemetery. The Wire Ravine Cemetery was a cemetery made after the Battle of the Somme. When the advance had moved forward beyond Beaumont-Hamel, the pioneers of the 51st Highland Division came across this ground to bury their dead. In addition to their own casualties, which compared to the first day of the Battle of the Somme had been relatively light, they found the bodies of the men from the 29th Division, the Borders, the South Wales Borderers, the Newfoundlanders and the Essex, littering the area of no man's land and around the German trenches. These men had laid out for over 4 months, and we can only but imagine the state that their bodies were in at this stage. So they were brought in for burial here to make what is essentially a mass grave, a collective grave of men whose bodies were found when the battle was at its end. As you walk down the road, you notice that many of the headstones have 2 or more names on them, again indicating clearly that this is a collective burial. There are 328 British soldiers buried here and 38 Newfoundlanders. Most of the British soldiers are from the South Wales Borderers or the Border Regiment. 1st of July 1916 is the predominant date, but there are some men from the Highland Division from that final attack on the 13th of November. And in one corner of the cemetery, quite a few men from the neighbouring Royal Naval Division, who you remember attacked close to this area on the same day. One of the Eyre family is in here, Lance Corporal Edward Eyre of the Newfoundland Regiment, who died on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. As we come out of the cemetery, we'll turn right and continue along the track. That'll take us up to the German lines. And one of the things that many people who come here notice is just even after over 100 years, how deep these German trenches are compared to the British ones that they've seen on their way into the park. They look permanent, and here they are. They'll be here, I hope, for all time. We'll follow the path round, and that'll take us to the 51st Highland Division Memorial, the so-called Jock on the Rock, a huge piece of Scottish granite with a fantastic bronze of a Scottish soldier from the Highland Division atop, looking out across the battlefields where the division advanced. Almost opposite this is a place like a little viewing platform where you can look down into the Wire Ravine, that old prehistoric quarry that runs from where we're standing now back into the village of Beaumont-Hamel. The Germans used it as like a communication trench to move up their men unseen by the British on the other side of no man's land, And you remember they had dugouts here that were linked by tunnels to the front line, enabling the men to shelter during the days of the trommel fire, the drum fire, the bombardment before the first day of the Somme, stay there uninjured, unhindered by the bombardment, and when 0 hour came, move up through those tunnels, get up into the front line and set up their machine guns and their rifle teams and await the arrival of the British attackers, who came towards them, as many German accounts on that day describe, as if on parade, walking. The Germans could hardly believe what they were seeing. And having defended that ground for so long, knowing every blade of grass, every corner of it, they knew exactly where to wait for the men to move into and be able to hit them with a maximum amount of fire and devastation, which is exactly what happened on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. We'll continue round the other side of the Highland Memorial, and that'll bring us to Hunter's Cemetery, which is a round position with headstones at the base of a cross of sacrifice. It's essentially a shell hole burial of men of the 51st Highland Division, Scottish troops who fell here in the attack on the 13th of November 1916. In this area we can see sections of the German trench quite clearly. There is one section where you can see what looks like a steel door, and it is. It's an entrance to the tunnels. There was quite a few documentaries made about the exploration of these tunnels, which are worth seeking out. And then from here we'll continue up through the trees to the next cemetery, which is Hawthorne Ridge number 2. Number 1 cemetery we can just see across the fields towards the Hawthorne mine just beyond this burial ground. This cemetery consists of 214 burials, of which 23 are Newfoundlanders. Most of the British burials here are from the South Wales borderers. This is roughly on the left flank of their advance, so the left portion of where their attack went in, where their trenches were quite close to the German ones around the Wye Ravine. And that picture that I'll put on the podcast website of British dead in the Wye Ravine is almost certainly somewhere in this area where we are now. So aside from being a memorial park, the Newfoundland Park is also the site of 3 military cemeteries, the burial grounds of soldiers who fell here at the two ends of the Battle of the Somme, the 1st of July and the 13th of November 1916. And from here we'll continue up what is a tree-lined avenue that brings us back out into the open to where the British front line is located. We'll walk along that. This is where the South Wales borderers went over the top on the 1st of July 1916 at 0 hour, and that'll bring us back to the junction of these tracks where we can look out across the battlefield here and see the park in its entirety. It's such an important part of the Western Front battlefields, this. Here's the Great War in microcosm. The events here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, depicting that popular view of the First World War of men being torn to pieces in a futile attack by machine gun fire. And then when we examine the attack here at the end of the Somme on the 13th of November, we discover a modern battle with modern weapons, modern approaches, a battle that was a success and saw a significant advance. The trench lines show us how the Western Front once looked. We have the whole makeup of a forward position on the battlefield, from the reserve to the support to the front line and all the communication trenches and all the minor trenches that were used for specific purposes like machine guns or mortars or even latrines. So it gives us this incredible, invaluable view, an insight into the First World War that it's difficult to find on many other parts of the British sector of the Western Front. I have no idea how many times I've been here personally, but I never tire of coming to this site, never tire of walking around the Newfoundland Park. It is a shame that more of the trenches cannot be explored as they once were, but this site is so important it does need to be preserved, and the footfall here would certainly damage what we see. So as we leave the park, we walk back past the caribou with its mouth open, looking out across the battlefields, a mother crying for its lost sons, the lost sons of Newfoundland, who fell here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. Do take time to subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or other podcast services. Tell us what you think using the hashtag OldFrontline. Follow me on Twitter at Sommecorps, and have a look at the podcast website www.oldfrontline.co.uk. I'll see you next week on the battlefields of the Great War.